Alright, this is Chapter 3, Lesson 1. I'm going to be doing kind of an introduction to integers, including an understanding of absolute value and opposite. Here you have a number line. Part of the problem is we spend all of our kindergarten through kind of 6th grade year dealing with the positive numbers. And then you get into 6th and 7th grade and they start saying, well, there's all these negative numbers that we need to deal with also. So I want you to understand the definition of integer. An integer are the whole numbers like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and going on forever. So a lot of times they just put ... because it's going to continue 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And their opposites, which we'll talk about opposites in just a moment. But the opposite of 1 is -1. The opposite of 2 is -2. So counting backwards in the negatives, ... forever going into the negatives. Now, to be honest, integers don't have decimal endings, fractional parts, so they should just be the whole numbers and their opposites. But we're going to be learning to deal with numbers in between there, like 2 and 3/4, or -1.75, or -3 1/5. Those would be all some things that you deal with. Okay, so integer. Some things we need to understand about integers. We need to understand some of the words. So you have some words that we'll talk about positive and negative. Things like below would be negative, while above would be positive. A lot of times gain would be a positive thing. Loss would be a negative thing. One in banking that a lot of times people deal with is deposit is a positive thing. It adds to your account. Withdraw is a negative thing, takes away from your account. Okay, so those are some words that you'll need to understand. So if I said it was 7 feet below sea level, that would be -7. A loss of 5 yards on the football field is a -5. A withdrawal of $200 from your bank account is -200. Is the way we'd write that as an integer. A deposit of $600, however, would be a $600 positive. We don't write the positive in front of it, but it still is a positive. A gain of 8 yards in football would be a positive 8. If it's 75 foot above sea level, that would be a positive 75. So once again, some positives versus negatives, understanding that we're still dealing with integers. All right, inside of that understanding of integer, we already talked about the word opposite, so I'll just go through that again. Opposites are basically the same number, but with the opposite sign. So the opposite of 2 is -2. The opposite of -4 is +4. The only thing that changes is whether it's positive or negative. Another word that means opposite is additive inverse. Additive inverse, we call it that because if you were to take two opposites like -3 and +3 and added them together, you'll always get back to 0. They inverse or undo each other. Okay? Another concept that we need to understand is absolute value. Absolute value is a number's distance from 0. So if I talk about the number 3, I'm going to plot 3 on a number line. It'll be right there. 3 is how far from 0? Well, it's 1, 2, 3 jumps away from 0. So the way we show absolute value is by bars around a number. The absolute value of 3 is 3. Alright, that's pretty easy. Let's talk about -2. I'm going to plot it. The absolute value of -2. This is where it gets confusing for people. Remember, the opposite, you change the sign. This time I didn't change the sign when it was +3. The absolute value is +3. But how far is -2 from 0? It's 2 jumps away from 0. Every absolute value will be expressed as a positive number. Okay? So, what's the absolute value of -3? 3. What's the absolute value of 3? 3. In other words, every absolute value is positive. But remember, don't get that confused with opposite and additive inverse. The opposite of a positive is a negative. The additive inverse of a negative is a positive. Okay? But absolute value, always positive. So one thing I'd like to help you with on that is you need to understand that the absolute value of -8 is 8, correct? But if there was a negative in front of it, that negative is not inside the absolute value bar, so I would not call that +8 still. That's the opposite of the absolute value of -8. Well, the absolute value of -8 is 8, but the opposite of that then becomes -8. And you might have noticed I just called that the opposite of. I would like you to get this understanding as well. You can read that as negative k, but a better way to think about it is the opposite of k. Because if I tell people that k is negative 7, then when they put it in here, some people will mess this up and say, well, already got the negative, so it's still just negative 7. But truly, if I substitute it for k, it would look like this. A negative negative 7. Well, that's a little bit confusing, but a negative negative 7 is actually a positive 7. So if you'll think about it this way instead, the opposite of k, well, the opposite of negative 7, what's the opposite of negative 7? Positive 7, which is exactly what the answer was. Does that make sense? So a lot of times I would read a number as just a negative 5, but if it was this, I wouldn't read it as negative p. I would read it as the opposite of p. So whatever p is, if it's positive, the answer to this will be negative. If p is negative, the answer to the opposite of will be back to a positive.